We definitely need the walking feet. I'm so grateful to be a part of a church where all the generations are not only here, but are blessed to be here. We heard a baby cry. We heard the children laughing and making noise. We honored our high school seniors, and we honored everyone beyond that. Thank you for being a part of a congregation that does that so well. I'd like to start off the sermon with a statement that could cause a bit of controversy, okay? Deep breath. Bread is so good. Bread is so good. There is nothing like bread. And I'm not talking about the stuff that you find pre-sliced and in long plastic bags in the grocery store. I'm not talking about Wonder Bread, okay? I'm talking about the hearty stuff, the homemade stuff. Loaves that are carefully kneaded with loving hands, attentively baked until the crust is golden and there's like a crispy crunch on the outside, but a very soft tenderness on the inside. You know what I'm talking about? The kind of bread that when you slather it with butter, it tastes like you've encountered the gates of heaven. Now you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, Now for our gluten-free friends, I do recognize that this might bring up a certain longing for you. Of the friends I've talked to who are gluten-free, while they note the goodness of staying away from the glutinous version of bread for their own well-being, there is never a sense that they are happy to do without the good stuff or the gluten-full stuff, and that the gluten-free option is not as good as the glutinous option, right? Okay. It's just not the same. It's not the same. I do need to taste yours. Hillary, would you come and bake some bread for us soon? Thank you. There is something about our longing for bread, for its simple goodness, for the way it smells and sounds and tastes and looks and feels, for the way it brings people together more than spinach would or apples would or cauliflower would, right? You don't bring cauliflower to a new neighbor. Maybe you do, but most people don't. If you would, please grant me the grace to make a connection between bread and God. The goodness of God is unmatched. The love of Jesus is more lovely, more vast than we could ever manufacture or package or brand. The wildness of the Spirit is so enticing to us, so unhindered as the scent of fresh bread from the oven is, so uncontainable, so irresistible once you know what that thing is. God is so good, so lovely, so wonderful, that those who experience this God cannot help but share this God. Today, as you've been hearing, we are beginning a series called Bless. And this series is actually an initiative birthed as a resource from our denomination, the Evangelical Covenant Church, to bless the world with the love of Jesus. And we do it through intentional practices, and I'll touch on those in a minute. And its biblical origin comes from Genesis chapter 12, which is at nearly at the beginning of the story of God. You see, God encounters a man named Abram, and he chooses Abram's family to be the funnel by which God pours out and over his blessing on the world. And you may be wondering why this Abram guy. We are not really sure. It could have really been anyone. But we see in Abram's life that where there was an impossibility of blessing, God permeates the impossibility and does something miraculous. You see, the understanding in those days, Abram's days, was that blessing was linked to offspring, to multiple generations. That the effectiveness of your life was how many children you were able to bring into the world. And when God encounters Abram in Genesis 12, he's childless, and therefore he is perceived as blessingless, meaning without blessing. And so instead of God just saying to Abram, oh, you can have kids, God actually gives Abram a blessing. Read it with me, Genesis chapter 12, the very beginning of the Bible. I'm going to read verses 2 and 3. They'll be on the screen. God says to Abram, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. God says, I will bless you, and you will be a blessing. God did not want to keep God's goodness to God's self. God has always been interested in loving the world, and God does not limit God's self to just divine interventions along the way. You see, God is interested in divine revelation that takes place through humans. His own created beings, God is interested in blessing through. And so, you, me, as created beings of God, we are blessed. Blessed with the goodness of God that satisfies our deepest hungers and needs. Blessed in the love of God that speaks to and nurtures both our joys and tends to our failures. Blessed in the nearness of God that comforts us and holds us and spurs us on. This is our blessing. We are blessed. I have a friend who's a baker, and she also loves Jesus fervently. And baking is her hobby, and because of Jesus, it is also her love language. She was a youth leader when I was a youth pastor, and she would regularly slip baked goods into my pocket, my literal pocket, okay? She would open up the pocket of my pants and put stuff in it. Or if I was wearing a jacket, she would put goods in my pocket. One time, something melted in there, and so I told her not to do that again. She would wrap these baked goods in red and white string, and she usually had a very specific reason for that baked good at that very specific time for me. Brownies, that I may know the richness of God's love. Blueberry scones, that I might consider things hidden within my midst. Or a chocolate chip cookie, that I may settle into the comforts of this walk of faith. She was intent on blessing me. Now, before we move forward, we need to note that there is a difference between blessing and being nice. It would be one thing to receive this kind of gift from someone who is nice. Here, I made you this cookie. Here's a cookie, okay? Or even if they did it out of kindness. Kindness is certainly an attribute of God. And when we encounter it, I am certain that we encounter the image of God in others who are kind. Kindness is one thing. Blessing also is different. It's another thing. Blessing comes from a place of being with God, of receiving from God, of experiencing God's goodness for ourselves in a very real way. And then through that, we are a blessing. Through God's goodness to us, we are able to goodness the world. Niceness is sourced in an individual who is nice. But blessing is sourced in God. Blessing from us out of our life is only possible if we have received from God. Back to my baking friend. She was faithful in receiving from God and then giving to others. And while her baked goods, melted or not, were indeed a good blessing to me, there were times that her gifts went above and beyond. That the things that came out of her oven actually spoke profoundly of the love of God to me. When she became aware of things in my life that were especially burdensome or challenging, she would bless me differently. I would say her blessing shifted, and I would receive a fresh loaf of braided and sugared cardamom bread. Some of you are quite familiar with cardamom bread. The loaves always came at the right time, and one loaf stands out in particular. I had just lost a dear friend and colleague to pancreatic cancer, and I was preparing to pastor her burial and her memorial service, well, in connection with her family. And my baker friend texted me one afternoon, and she said, "I'm coming over with a warm loaf of cardamom bread. Get the butter out of the fridge." That's all she said. And so she showed up at my house with this loaf of cardamom bread, the result of her blessing. And she was still in her apron, and there were white handprints of baking residue all over that apron. And she had flour on her face, and it was in her hair. And she handed me the loaf wrapped up so as to keep the smell snug in there, so that when I opened it, I got to experience it. And then she gave me a hug. And she smelled like bread. She smelled like cardamom and sugar and flour. She smelled like the thing of her blessing. You see, she was in the kitchen long enough, dealing with the goodness intently enough, that the aroma of the goodness adhered to her. It surrounded her. It got stuck in her hair. It consumed her. 2 Corinthians 2:15 says that we are the aroma of Christ. We are the aroma of Christ among those who are being redeemed. To smell like Christ, you must first be with Christ. To smell like a blessing, you must first receive and revel in the goodness of God. We have no business. We have no business blessing others if we think that we are the source of the blessing. But once you experience something so good, so fulfilling, so lovely, so rich and irresistible, you can't help but smell like that thing, be that thing, be covered in that thing. And you can't help but want to offer that thing to other people. If it's on you, hopefully it could get on others. Evangelism is a really interesting word. Evangelism comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means good news bringer. All right? It's actually the word for angels in the New Testament, those that were sent to people to give them good news of great joy for all people. We hear that at Christmas time. It was the word for those people who were sent with the good news specifically of Jesus. And then when after Jesus died, was resurrected, and then ascended into heaven, and the Holy Spirit was poured out onto the church, this thing happened called apostles, and they were euangelion. They were good news bringers to the world. Those angels, those apostles were filled with the divine Spirit of God, and they went out to specific people all over the world to share what God had already inspired. They brought with them the news of God's unfathomable love, of Jesus' redeeming sacrifice through death on the cross, and then the promise of a full and redeemed life because Jesus rose from the dead and made resurrection possible for all things everywhere. This news that they brought with them, because they were good news bringers, it met a very hungry world and very hungry individuals. And those who were hungry, when they encountered them, they feasted on what they had to offer, and they slathered butter on top of it. Since that time, there has been a temptation, I would say, to package up the good news of Jesus. We've pre-sliced it We filled it with preservatives. We've wrapped it in plastic with a little twisty tie so as not to just to damage it. And then we've distributed it on our own terms. Instead of being bakers covered in the evidence of the goodness of bread, we have become factory workers with hairnets and gloves. We've become sanitized with the effects of the good news that is for us too. And because of this, our good news bringing, our evangelism, has sometimes been reduced to a formula instead of a following. It's been condensed to a decision rather than discipleship. It's been packaged into making a sale rather than making an invitation. I admit I'm even a little wary of this. Bless, the tagline for it is an intentional evangelism initiative. I'm a little wary of it, okay? Because I don't want us to rely on a formula or a prepackaged idea when it comes to blessing the world with the love of the blessing of God. But I wonder, could this bless initiative be more like a recipe to us than a formula? Could it help us know the elements that make our good news sharing actually satisfying to a hungry world? Could it be the things that we put together, stir up, and knead, get all over ourselves even, so that when we go out into the world, people are like, you've been up to something. It's in your hair. It's on your apron. In seeking to bless others, we are relying on the delightful goodness of God that is already with us and that cannot be replicated or reduced. And so then we get to walk around covered in it, smelling like it, making people wonder what has happened to us because we are different in the world. This is the bless recipe, if you will. Bless is an acronym for 5 missional practices, and we are going to spend our time talking about those during the next 3 months. The first ingredient is begin with prayer. That's the B. We'll be praying for people in our life who have yet to encounter God's deep love, God's deep goodness, God's deep blessing. And we'll be asking the question of God, how do you want to use me to bless the people in my life? Asking God a question like that is prayer. The next ingredient is L, is to listen with care by paying attention to people's dreams and their pain and listening for evidence of God's work in their life. The third ingredient is E, eat together. We'll share meals and life with people in our lives who have not yet tasted or smelled the goodness of God. And in so doing, when we are eating together, we will notice and speak to evidence of God's presence as we gather together. And then the first S is serve in love. We will be attentive for opportunities God provides us to care for people and attend to their needs. And then the second S is to share our story. Once a relationship is built and trust is developed, and there is no timeline for any of those things, we'll begin to look for ways to share our own story and the story of Jesus' transforming work in our life and in the world. BLESS. It's simple, really. Bread and its recipe is not complicated, but it is an art form. And you have tasted bad bread, and you have tasted good bread. You know the difference. Throughout the next 3 months, we're going to spend 2 weeks on each of these recipe ingredients, these missional priorities. And we're going to examine the biblical examples of these good news sharing activities. And there will also be time to practice what we preach, with suggested practices for us to do together on Sunday mornings, but then also practices that you might engage with the other 6 days of the week with your family, with your neighbors, with your friends, with your coworkers, with your classmates. And then interspersed throughout the summer, we want to be sure that we're hearing back from you. There'll be an opportunity for testimony, for us to hear from one another what God is doing with you, through you, for you, how you might be covered in all that goodness. And that first Testimony Sunday will be on July 2nd, so mark your calendars. And then Labor Day weekend will be kind of the conclusion of our series. But instead of just concluding and saying, that's great, we got to eat together. And so we're going to have a celebratory meal that takes place of a worship service. And the point is that throughout this time, you are asking and considering, God, who is it that you want me to bless? And then you might make an invitation. Hey, come to church with me. But it's not going to be sitting in the pews and stand up, sit down. There's a place for that, and I appreciate it, okay? But we're just going to eat together. And you don't have to do anything. You just get to come and be blessed. Mark your calendars for Labor Day Sunday. As we transition to communion, I want to share one last story. Every week, a small team of people prepare the elements for communion. And Phyllis is especially keen on purchasing the bread. She gets the good stuff, okay? And she makes a small cut down the center of the bread. This is like behind the scenes information for you, so that the person up here is less likely to look like they're struggling so much when it's time to break the bread. We thank God for Phyllis, okay? And because we're still using these very handy-dandy containers, which are important, we don't usually eat the bread. And that's where my children come in. You might know this already. Phyllis and the communion team have generously offered the bread to my kids after the service. And sometimes my kids would like to seek to bless other kids, and so they share the bread. But sometimes they don't. And so these two halves, one gets in one hand and one gets in the other. And because Phyllis chooses very good, crusty, golden bread and that has a good bit of crunch, when my children eat this bread, crumbs are everywhere. And one particular Sunday, a half loaf made it into the trunk of our car. And then we put a variety of things on top of that half loaf, not realizing that the half loaf was in the car. And what produced was a massive amount of crumbs and chunks, okay? And in my exasperation, standing there at the trunk of our car, I yell out, the body of Christ is everywhere. Oh, would that not be the best news? Christ everywhere, in the chunks stuck in the carpet, all over us, our cheeks messy with it, people noticing you've got something on the hope of complete satisfaction and renewal and redemption all over the place, the truth that no matter what you've done or who you think you are, you belong to Jesus all over you. That you not only belong to Jesus, but that you belong to a community of people who love Jesus all over. What if those crumbs, those small bits, were enough to satisfy the world? I think they are. As we come to the table today, it is not just that you would receive your small portion and that would be enough. You are feasting on the goodness of God for you and for the whole world. And we first wants you to experience it for yourself, to be covered in it, so that you might go out and bless. Would you pray with me? God, I thank you that you were not stingy with us. That from the dawn of creation, you wanted goodness for us.